In this episode, I'm feeling a bit sentimental about role-playing games in the 1980s. So, stick around. Hello, fellow dorks and dorkettes, and welcome to sentiMENTAL. My name is Rob, and this is the show where I talk about my personal history and memories of a specific topic from growing up in the 1980s. Now, I really need to emphasize that this is my personal history and experiences with these topics. I'm sorry that I have to add that, but I feel like a lot of people viewing this show don't understand the personal side of it. Now, I get bombed in the comments on a lot of these topics for some reason because people don't get the whole personal side of it. These experiences might not be what you had, or I'm not here to give you a history lesson on these topics. This is just my personal experiences, and I just want a place to talk about them. Like I said, the show is called sentimental, with an emphasis on the mental part, because, you know, a lot of the topics, when I take the time to speak about them, are things that have been weighing on my mind recently, and I kind of feel like I just need an outlet to get them out there. So, with all that being said, if this isn't the type of video that you're looking for, please just click off now, because I don't want to disappoint you or waste your time. With that being said, it is now time to get mental. And what we're getting sentimental about this episode is role-playing games in the 1980s. Now, before I begin my personal journey into role-playing games during the 80s, I think I need to point out that we pretty much all have shared the same humble beginnings of dabbling within the sci-fi and fantasy worlds, and that is through movies. I mean, we all pretty much grew up watching Star Wars and different fantasy movies like Clash of the Titans or the Ray Harryhausen Sinbad movies. I mean, those played pretty much every weekend on the, local syndicated stations, and I loved every minute of them. I mean, those immersed me into fantasy worlds and allowed me to, take on adventures that those characters would have had in my own backyard. Also, for me, around my house, my mom was a very avid reader. So much, in fact, that she eventually opened up her own bookstore that she ran very successfully for many decades. But anyway, with having a reader like her that read all different genres, there were plenty of fantasy novels laying around my house. Now, I was too young to embark on those journeys between the covers, but those covers had beautiful artwork that took me away to awesome fantasy settings and sci-fi settings, and it's like I took a moment to create my own story just from the awesome artwork on the covers. I think by the time 1983 rolled around, I had a pretty good understanding of what fantasy was. So when the Dungeons and Dragons cartoon hit the airwaves, I was all about it. I mean, I loved tuning in every week, Saturday morning, and seeing what adventures these unlikely heroes would get into. And yeah, it is so great to see that so many people have shared in the love of that cartoon, that we had like that awesome car commercial, a DVD of the complete series, which ended way too soon, if I might add, and awesome collectibles that have a pretty hefty price tag. But like I said, it's just awesome that so many people still have a nostalgic appreciation for this show. But 1983 also brought about the LJN action figures. I loved these figures so much By this time, I was getting into G.I. Joe, Masters of the Universe, and these figures kind of filled a niche of being in between, because they were the scale of the G.I. Joe figures, but fantasy like the Masters of the Universe figures. So my Strongheart and War Duke kind of palled around with G.I. Joe and Cobra, because, like I said, they were the same size, and they may not have been as articulated as the G.I. Joe figures. They were just still so awesome, so well made, and had many different characters to choose from. Unfortunately, like I said, I only had Strongheart and War Duke, and a couple of the PVC figures that were also equally awesome. But growing up at that time, I knew somebody that had the complete collection. And kind of surprising, it was friends of my parents. They were my parents' age. They didn't have kids, but they had all the figures lining shelves in their office. They also had the complete run of original Star Wars New Hope figures that they allowed me to play with. But the D&D figures were off limits. I could view them from afar, and unfortunately, it's not until I was much older when I started to piece together and realize that they were gamers. I have vague recollection of seeing various Dungeons and Dragons books in that office of theirs, and this huge collection of the Dungeons and Dragons figures. But growing up, I just thought that was normal. I mean, they didn't have kids, so they still played with toys. So kids must have been the cutoff point of stop being cool. But I'm evidence of that not being true. 1983 was a really weird year. And it's a topic that I hope to do a whole episode on in the future. I've been thinking about it for years, I just don't know how to attack it. But 1983 was a year where fantasy and Dungeons and Dragons itself seemed to step up and defy the satanic panic that was gripping the country, was gripping the world at the time. We had a lot of conservative religious groups trying to cast this evil shadow on role-playing games, on fantasy, on sci-fi, painting it as this tool of Satan, that if you enjoy these things, you must be downright evil. To be honest, the only evil thing here were them trying to prevent people from having a good time. But like I said, 83 was weird because not only did you have the D&D cartoon and toys, which were just waving a flag of defiance, you also had an onslaught of fantasy-inspired TV shows, movies, games, toys. I mean, 83 was a pretty hot year for fantasy and role-playing games. And of course, I had no idea at the time. This is just something that I look back at and see a timeline and just really see this big blip during 1983. And on the topic of satanic panic and my experience with it, I really didn't know it was going on until the 90s. That was when I was a hardcore gamer, and when different books and pamphlets were making the rounds in my gaming group and with my, metalhead friends, of us reading these and laughing hysterically. So I really didn't know that was going on until that time period. And my history during the 90s will be for an episode down the road. So, like I said, this is just the 80s portion of my life with role-playing games and fantasy and things like that. Anyway, like I said earlier about my mom being this avid reader, my mom would read these awesome fantasy books, and if she thought that it was something that I would enjoy, she would just give me a Cliff Note version of what was going on in these books. So yeah, there were a lot of great books that I had an appreciation for, but I never read. And yeah, they just really filled me with wonder. But it wasn't until around 1984 when the Dragonlance trilogy was released where she really would sit down every morning after she would read the books and tell me about the trials and tribulations of the characters in them. So, yeah, I loved characters like Tanis and Tasselhoff and Rastalin and Cameron before I even really knew who they were, because she was just passing on this spoken word version of the novels that she was reading and she was enjoying. So I would look at the awesome Larry Elmore covers and, piece together the stories that she would share to me, and I would be whisked away to Corinne and just love every moment of my own created stories, just based on what I had in front of me. And that leads me back to an awesome little nugget about those friends of my parents. I remember one Halloween, they went to a costume party, and their friends dressed up as characters from Dragonlance. The dude went as Sturm, and the lady went as Tika. And speaking of Tika, they even named their awesome husky Tika. Awesome dog, had beautiful blue eyes, very fluffy. I loved being a little kid playing with that huge monster of a dog that was so sweet. So we fast forward to when I was in 5th grade. When I was in 5th grade, I made a friend that I had for decades afterwards. He was my first best friend, and he introduced me to a couple things that I didn't know about, like Dungeons and Dragons, the actual role-playing game. Of course, I knew of the cartoon, I knew of the toys, and I loved them. I really didn't know, other than like fleeting memories of seeing the books at my parents' friend's house, that it was a game and books and awesome. So he would check out from the local library like the Player's Manual, the Dungeon Master's Guide, the Dungeoneer's Survival Guide, Oriental Adventures, Deities and Demigods. I mean, my local library had all this stuff. I had no idea these books existed, but once we had a couple of sleepovers where we would pour through these books and make up characters that we never played. We never played the game, but we would make up these really uber powerful characters and pretend to be them while we ran around his backyard and in his woods. And yeah, his family was the type that would allow him, because they collected them, have swords and things like that, axes, so we would grab those and go out into the woods and pretend that we were these adventurers that we created. Now, we didn't follow the rules, we just took bits and pieces and, like I said, made up these uber powerful characters and just had fun in our own minds running around in his backyard. So, maybe LARPing? Speaking of LARPing, when I was in Cub Scouts, my parents were den leaders, and they would go to these big grandiose meetings in our area. Well, the college in the town that I grew up in had a LARPing club, and some of representatives of that club showed up to, teach them about this club in the area and to see if any of the kids would be interested in joining it. Now, I remember these guys when, they were announced, here is so-and-so from the LARPing club. They burst through the door, one from this side of the room with a shield and a sword. This one from another part of a room came through with a bow and arrow and shot it at the guy. He deflected it with his shield, and it was awesome. I don't think the parents really saw it that way. Like I said, this was the time of Satanic panic, but I thought it was awesome, and I wanted in. But after that experience, it just kind of drifted from my memory, and it wasn't until later that I started piecing everything together where I was like, that's what that was! That's awesome! Next is when I entered middle school. Now, the one thing about the middle school I went to, it was pretty close to my house, so I was able to ride my bike to school. And from there, I was allowed to hang out on the Main Street area of our town because it was right next to the middle school. So I would bike to school. After school, I would bike to Main Street. Now, I did a whole episode of growing up in a small town in the 80s where I talked about the awesome landmarks and things of the Main Street of my town. And one of those places that I mentioned in that was a place called Bobby's Hobby Lobby. I assume it was owned by a guy named Bobby, or a girl, but this place had it all, and it was the only real hobby craft type of store in my town for the longest time. I mean, they had this awesome train garden that was huge in this big glass enclosure with a pretty much an old-fashioned doorbell thing that you would push and the train would start and go make a couple laps and before it eventually turned off. But during these excursions into town, I would go to Bobby's Hobby Lobby and the library. While at the library, I would pore over the D&D books. I would find other fantasy books to flip through, even real historical books about armor and weapons, those man, myth, legend books, the Time Life books. I mean, they had all those in the reference section, so I could never check them out, but I would read them all while I was there. I would go across the street to the Rexall, buy a nickel Coke, get some dime candy, and have a great day. But when I would go to Bobby's Hobby Lobby, they had D&D books there, and I would flip through them. When I would have enough money, I would buy Dragon magazines that were in the clearance section when they were a few months old, and I would take them home and pore through them. And granted, I had no idea what the heck I was reading. One of the things, because I read comics at the time, of course, was looking at the Marvel File, which was about the TSR Marvel role-playing game, which would have a huge impact on my life during the 90s, all the way up until, unfortunately, I stopped gaming. But anyway, I would pore through those, look at the different characters that would in the Marvel File, read the comics in the back of the Dragon magazine, where I loved SnarfQuest, one of my favorites, Larry Elmore, hands down one of my favorite fantasy artists of all time. And SnarfQuest, I did an episode of It Came From My Side of the Laundry Room where I showed off a graphic novel that I got of SnarfQuest in the 80s. Anyway, yeah, I would love looking at Dragon magazines, and I had a good stack for a very long time. Also, during this time in middle school, when I was really a hardcore comic book dork on top of all this, I discovered the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I read about them in an issue of Comic Scene magazine, if you remember that. And it was an interview with Eastman and Laird. It talked about the comic. And at that time, it was kind of coming out very sporadically. It was still, of course, black and white, still 100% independent. And yeah, ever since that exposure in that magazine, I wanted every bit of TMNT stuff I could get my hands on. So on weekends, me and the buddy that I met in 5th grade, his mom would take us to various comic book stores in the area. I would always look for Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle comics and usually not find any. They were that independent at the time that they were really hard to come by. But one day we went to a comic book store and they didn't have any of the comics, but they had the TMNT and Other Strangeness role-playing game put out by Palladium Games. Now that was an essential source book of the TMNT at that time. I mean, it had the characters, write-ups on them, all 4 Turtles, Casey Jones, April, Splinter, Shredder, the Foot Clan, what have you. But on top of that, it had awesome created mutant animals for you to play and to make, and I was so enthralled by it. And I think that's where my little bit of a furry streak came from. Of course, from there, I had to track down all the different source books and campaign books and other Palladium games because I really dug the art style, the game itself. And mind you, I had this collection of game books and other various bric-a-brac from Palladium and TSR at this time, but I never played a single one. I just loved reading them, and I loved... Now, at that time, I had no comprehension of the rules, but I loved the worlds and the universes and, the realms. Speaking of realms, it was a few years after that where I was introduced to the Forgotten Realms by the Crystal Shard book. Written by R.A. Salvador, it was probably the first fantasy book that I felt like I found on my own. My mom didn't help. It wasn't from any of the friends that I had met. This was a book that I found all by myself in the Kmart book section. And just the cover alone, I bought it and I devoured it. And the other books came out in the trilogy eventually, and I read all those. And not to skip ahead into the 90s, but all the other Drist books and Icewind Dale books and what have you, I devoured all those until I eventually cut it off. But that's a story for another time. Also in this time period, 89-ish, I was really into DC Comics. I read Marvel all the way up to this point, but DC, that's when they were really making a name for themselves as the more mature alternative to Marvel. So, being a, older kid, cool dude at that time, I kind of gravitated towards that. And with that, the Walden books in my mall, they had the DC role-playing game. It was a box set, and you got, different supplies for playing the game. You got different source books that talked about all the different places within the DC universe, different heroes and villains, and these awesome cards that on the back had the stats for the characters. Everybody from Batman to Superman to Green Arrow to Etrigan to Black Canary to Huntress had these cards and had their stats and had a little bit of their background in the books. But that kicked off another trend for me where I wanted to track down the different supplement books and the different source books. And this was the time period that I finally was introduced to The Dark Knight Returns and Watchmen. So I found the Watchmen source book and had to get that. And I also signed up for the DC role-playing game fan club. And like every month I was getting these awesome newsletters sent to my house that had stats on characters that didn't appear in the books but were added on. And I still have a bunch of those. Definitely my favorite is when they added Lobo into the DC role-playing game universe. But with the introduction of that game, I finally got around to getting the Marvel Superheroes role-playing game by TSR and those different source books and campaign books. Interestingly enough, a lot of those source books and stuff were at my KB toy store. I remember getting a lot of the Mutant Bomb with Wolverine on the cover and the various, Spider-Man street-level game books. And there was also a Marvel New York box set I remember getting all around this time period. But like I said, I had all these books and I loved reading them because they were comprehensive source books for things that I enjoyed, either it be sci-fi or comics or the Turtles, and I would devour those books just for that. I was a huge fan of the Marvel Universe comics, that were dossiers on all the characters, or the DC Who's Who, and this was just an extension of that. So I read them, but never played the games until I got to high school. And that's where, if I pick this up again, we will get into my high school career of role-playing games and being in the strategic gaming club for all 4 years of high school and loving every minute of it. So, why am I now being infected with these memories and becoming mental? Well, the answer is quite simple, actually. The place where my kids are getting their art lessons, the art studio that I mentioned in the episode where I introduced you all to Asher, and the episode where I talk about the G.I. Joe role-playing game, well, next to that art studio is a game store. They sell a bunch of board games and role-playing games. And spending a lot of time in there, just passing the time with my wife and enjoying our company together and browsing, I really have a hankering for some gaming. Now, I've always wrestled with the idea of running a game for my kids, and that has very much grown into, hopefully, what will be a reality very soon. I'm going to start getting at least the basic core books of the 5th edition of Dungeons & Dragons, and I will peruse those and read them and learn about the new rules, because it's been a couple editions since I've played. And I'm hoping after I get a good bearing on the rules, I can run a game for my kids. And I'm hoping, and I think, that they'll enjoy it. I mean, they are just chock full of imagination. They love pretending now. I mean, they love video games. They love making up their own comics and drawing pictures of different... Like my son, who plays Fortnite, draws pictures of weapons that he creates and different skins that he would make. So I think with all of that jammed together, I think they might like role-playing games. Hopefully. So I'm going to try and, thinking about it, I think it could be very beneficial. I think it was beneficial to me. I didn't have anyone helping me, at least on a family level, but I think it was beneficial for me for my imagination. You learn math on the fly. You learn new ways to conquer situations and enemies. So you have to use your brain and, puzzles and things. You work your way through it and you learn different social aspects of it, especially if you go somewhere and game with a bunch of strangers. And you also, and believe me, this part didn't benefit me at all, but that social bit and the public speaking of pretending to be someone else, either you add an accent or not. I mean, I did it, but unfortunately it didn't help me in the long run because I'm still socially anxious and awkward. But anyway, I'm hoping those things help them in the long run, and they have fun while doing it. So I'm really excited to jump in and try that, and in the future I will hopefully, in an entertaining way, be able to tell you about the adventures that we've gone on. And with that, I'm going to close the book on my memories of role-playing games in the 80s. So I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, please give me a thumbs up. If you got something to say, please leave a comment. I love reading them, and I love getting back to everybody. And if you're new around here and you enjoyed this, or any of the episodes that YouTube is recommending down here, please hit subscribe. And if you hit that little bell icon, you will be notified whenever there's a new episode. So anyway, until next time, thanks for watching. Keep being rad and stay dorky.